So tonight's topic will be on one of the major themes of the Quran, which is God, right? So the Quran is a very theocentric text. Any conversation in the Quran always goes back to God, is always connected to God. And I mentioned in the in our first session that the name for God in the Quran is Allah. Which is basically a combination of El-Ilah, the one God, the one creator God. And our conceptions of the one God might differ, right? And so the focus tonight is really on the Islamic, the Quranic understanding of God. And it's also a theme that is very much focused in the Risale-i-Nur, which is not surprising because the Risale-i-Nur as an exegetical work focuses on the Quran, is trying to build Quranic literacy. So you see Nursi spending a lot of time on the divine qualities of God, talking about, the divine names. And if you want to know what the Islamic understanding of God is in the Islamic tradition, we have to turn to the Quran. Because as I mentioned last time, the Quran is the very self-expression of God. It's God's speech. It's the way he introduces himself to the creation. It's his discourse with the creation. So we have to look into the Quran in order to understand who God is, right? Because God himself introduces, his attributes in the Quran. So when we turn to the Quran talks about the most beautiful names of God, the divine names of God, right? It actually uses the term al-asma al-husna, the most beautiful names, the divine names. And the piece that I shared, the Quran chapter, I think chapter 59, the passage that I shared with you is actually referred to often as the jewel of the Quran, because it really focuses then these passages on the divine names and introduces the reader to these divine qualities. The classic locus or the classic location for these divine names has been chapter 17, verse 110, in which the Quran states, "Call upon God or call upon the merciful, whichsoever you call upon, to God belong the most beautiful names." So there are certain qualities, attributes, traits that God assigns to himself. Now I understand already the limitation in the English language because I say he, right? Or sometimes we see in theological conversation, is God a he or a she, right? In many languages, actually, we don't have the pronoun. Like, for example, in the Turkish language that I'm familiar with too, there's no he and she. That's why many people who learn English actually struggle with the pronoun, because there's only one pronoun, right? So similarly in the Arabic language, there's no gender assigned to Allah. There's no gender assigned to God. He's gender, again, the limitations of the English language, I say he, but Muslims don't think of Allah in those terms, in terms of gender, he or she, because as we will see, the Quran itself always makes stresses that God is unlike his creation. I often tell people just learn Turkish or another language where the pronoun does not exist, and then you basically solve all the theological problems there. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he actually in one of his traditions, he talked about that God has 99 names, but we should be cautious with that number. The Quran actually exhausts the number 99. In Arabic, 99 refers to infinite names of God. Like when you say, oh, there were like thousands of people, you don't really know the exact number, but it gives you a sense of that there is an infinite number of people, that is so vast you can't even count those names. They are countless, basically. Now, when the Quran, talks about God, it very much makes the point on God's what we call incomparability, that, declaring that God is utterly other, that he's transcendent, that he is unlike his creation, right? In some of these verses, right? Nothing is like him, as Qur'an, chapter 42 states, and there's none like unto him, right? So emphasizing, stressing the tanzih aspect, that's an Arabic word, basically in Islamic theology, declaring that God is utterly incomparable to the creation. He can never be compared, he can never be comprehended by his creation, right? At the same time, Islamic theology is always also concerned to affirming similarity with God, because the Quran also makes references that God breathed into the human being something of his spirit, right? It's really, the term is ruhi, right? Something of the divine is instilled into the human being. So human nature has this divine spark, is endowed with the divine spark, is basically created with the divine spirit, with the ruh. What the nature of the ruh is, that spirit, that part of the divine. Actually, there's silence in the Islamic sources, because even the Prophet Muhammad, when he was asked, what's the nature of the spirit? What's the nature of the ruh? To which he responded that he doesn't even have the answer to that question. That is something that really only God has knowledge about, what that spirit is. So there's an element in every human being, that every human being, every human nature has God's spirit in them, in the nature, right? So the Quran wants to strike a very important balance of declaring that God is utterly other, but at the same time emphasizing his nearness, that human beings have elements of the divine in themselves, right? That God is very close to the human being, as it says here in one of the verses, that God is closer to the human being than his jugular vein, very close, right? So again, throughout Islamic history, Muslims have been very concerned in striking a very careful balance of making sure that the transcendence of God is, declared, but at the same time, his immanence, right? That he's near, he's very close. At the same time, he's utterly other than the creation. Now, again, this is just a selection. I wasn't able to find a good image, but it's a very just a short snapshot of the divine names. So we talk about the dual mode of God's nature. So there is a very, almost what we say, the divine names of wrath and divine names of majesty and authority and sovereignty. But then the Quran stresses the divine names of mercy and kindness and love and forgiveness. So it's always this, what we call in Islamic theology, the dual, mode of the divine nature, basically. Almost, you see in the prophetic tradition, sometimes God's nature is described in a very motherly way, right? And then there's also the fatherly, the more, the emphasis on the authoritarian, on the, on the sovereignty of God, on his dominion and his power, which again is not, it's complementing each other, right? If you just think of the example of parenting, for example, there's always sometimes when you enforce certain rules or enforce something, that mercy pretty much is dominant in your parenting, but sometimes, there needs to be discipline, and sometimes certain rules need to be enforced because of a compassionate, approach, like really taking it holistically. So in the Quranic framework and in the Risale-e-Nur, again, following the Quranic model, it talks a lot, the Quran talks a lot about the signs of God. Everything in the creation is a sign of God. And if you just think about a sign has a significance. It points to something or someone, right? So when we talk about the signs of God in the Quran, they are called ayat. So all beings, all events in the universe are signs of God. They are love letters, so to speak, letters of God that need to be read, right? A sign has a significance and it calls to be read because there's a message ultimately hidden there, right? So in Islamic theology, there are two ways of looking at things in the universe, or at at something or someone. You can either look, I mean, I give here provide the example of a flower. You can look at the flower and say, the flower is beautiful, right? It's a self-referential look, or what the Risale Nur calls a manai ismi approach, right? You look at the thing or the object as it refers to itself. The flower is beautiful. The other approach would be other indicative, right? You say the flower is made beautiful. Now, what's the difference here? Of course, the difference is fundamental. So the one paradigm does not acknowledge the maker, does not acknowledge the creator, does not acknowledge and honor, the designer, the beautifier. The other paradigm, Quranic paradigm, says, look at the flower and acknowledge the maker, the designer, right? The fashioner, the compassionate one. And by acknowledging the signs of God, which are the names of God, basically, and really understanding the significance, you're making that sacred connection to the divine. You're really exploring the divine names and trying to cultivate a sacred outlook. But it's not just sufficient to know the names of God, looking at the flower and say, okay, the flower is made beautiful. I see there's a design, there's a shape, there's some beauty, there's some gentleness, there's some smell, right? There's some generosity, because technically I don't need the flower, to survive, but it's there. It's not just sufficient then for the reader to say, okay, the flower is made beautiful, but the names of God invite us to also display them in our own lives. So if I see God as a designer, I'll give that example here. So if, again, to stay with the signs of God, or the sunflower here, you look at the sunflower and you realize, wait a minute, in order for the sunflower to come into existence, there need to be seasons. There needs to be a certain constellation of the planets and the stars, right? The universe has to be in a certain position in order for the sunflower to come into existence, right? So, very much related also to the design argument. But in order for all these elements to come into a certain place and arrangement, somebody has to enforce that system. So that brings us to one name of God, which is Al-Jabbar, the subduer, the somebody who forces a system or creates that system in a very powerful way, where all these elements come together, and then the sunflower can come into existence, because you need the sun to be in a certain position, in an exact position, right? You need the constellations to be in a very complicated position, in a harmony with each other. To coordinate that, you need somebody to subdue them all, right? And that's one of the most powerful names of one of the names of God is Al-Jabbar, the one who subdues, the one who enforces a certain, system, so that life can come into existence. Now let's stay with the example of the sunflower, right? So we have the creator. Now for Nursi, it's really important that, when we talked about last time, to cultivate a sacred outlook of the universe. You look at the flower, and either nature has created the sunflower, or you have to say a creator, right? He says, okay, if we say nature, what is nature? It's blind forces. It's earth, air, soil, air, fire, right? Those kind of things. And so can they create a sunflower? Can they actually subdue everything, all these elements in the universe? For him, the answer is no. For the believer, it's no. So then the sunflower invites the reader to say, okay, what's my significance? Well, I'm pointing to creator. I cannot design myself. As a sunflower, I'm a limited, being. Nature, what we call nature itself, very limited in the knowledge capacity, in their skills. So then the significance is, I'm pointing to a creator God, Al-Khaliq. Further reading, cultivating a sacred reading. We see the sunflower, somebody has fashioned the sunflower. Somebody has, really, paid attention to the design, right? And the Quran says that God is Al-Musawwir, the fashioner. He fashions, the creation according to a certain wisdom. There's knowledge involved, which then, there's beauty involved. There's a beauty, obviously. We say, oh my God, oh, awesome, amazing. There's something that creates in us this connection with the sunflower because we acknowledge the beauty. But again, the other indicative reading would be to say, this flower was made by Al-Jamil, the beautiful one. He has bestowed it with beauty, right? And so it creates in us a sense of amazement. And then again, there's something that the sunflower moves within us, our human nature, that we feel some compassion and kindness, and we feel, there's a certain comfort and love. So there are other names that then come into display, which is the compassionate one, Ar-Rahman, the loving. Somebody's expressing his love, right? Usually flowers are used to express love. But we also, read there's a certain gentleness, right? So another name of God is the gentle, the loving. And it's also, again, very important in the other mode of God. Again, there is a design here, which means that a very complex arrangement of the flower, which points to some sense of justice. Somebody has put a certain balance and harmony, which then points to God's name, the just. And then again, from that flower, we see God has not only created one sunflower, but there are, endless sunflowers. And every season, there is this sense of generosity that we experience. So God's name of Al-Karim, the generous one. And interestingly, even if the sunflower decays, it's preserved in our memory, in our hearts. It still lives on, the memory is preserved, the seed is preserved, the DNA is preserved. So that points to God, the preserver, Al-Hafiz. And so the message is, the seed of a sunflower, as God, preserves that seed, it's also preserved in the memory of the, the human being and the hearts of the human being, that sunflower, right? The nourisher, the sunflower makes us happy. That's also an emotional nourishment, but also it has seeds and the oil that nourishes our human body. So it's not just a material nourishment, but there's an emotional nourishment involved. Now, again, as I said, it's not sufficient to just read these names, but then to actively display them in our own lives. For the Muslim, it then means, okay, I now need to, after I have gained a certain limited knowledge of God, what does this mean now for me? Well, I try to be nourishing in every way. I try to provide emotional nourishment. I try to provide, material, physical nourishment to my family, to my community, to people in need. I try to preserve, right? I try to protect life, because there's an effort to protect even a very simple plant life, right? So there's no waste, right? So there's an effort always to reuse and revive the creation. God's generosity, if God's generosity is displayed in the sunflower, then that calls the human being to be equally generous, to be equally just, to be equally gentle and loving and compassionate, and be life-giving and creative and constructive. So that's the sacred outlook that I think the Quran tries to, cultivate in human beings. And that's with the Risale Nur, is a similar effort to when we look at things, even in the secular world, we have the lens, the sacred lens of, the divine names. Every time when we approach a human being or any creation, right? Because we have that sacred lens, we are then able to read these names and then also, beautify our own lives through the lens of the divine names. I thought this was interesting because ultimately in Islamic calligraphy, where a lot of Quranic verses are used, the idea is that all beings, even if they don't embrace a faith in God, are infused with the signs of God. They don't necessarily have to embrace, right, the faith in God, but if somebody cultivates that sacred outlook, they are able to see, the sacredness of every being. Okay, and this is a piece that I like to show you, where when you look at it, the artist here tries to play or tries to convey these two modes of God. So the names of majesty and sovereignty and power, you see that kind of black element in the video. And then in the white, you see the illuminated, the light that is present everywhere. So you see these two modes of God, basically the nearness and the distance, and trying to basically hold them together. So we are going to, hopefully that works, watch this little video together. It's a video that is based on the Quranic divine names of God. In the video, there is an emphasis on the divine names of mercy and compassion, on the presence of God everywhere, infusing every human being, regardless of ethnic background, racial background. So you've seen the universality displayed. On the other hand, the Black stresses God's transcendence, his distance from the human being, but also the darkness of the human being when it comes to the weakness and the vulnerability. So with the Black also, the artist, the Muslim artist also wants to stress that the vulnerability and the weakness and the impotence of the human being is also a connection to the divine. I mean, is a way to connect to the divine names, because the more we experience our own vulnerability and our own weaknesses, the more we actually experience the divine name. So I'll give you an example. If we are very hungry, we have a more intense experience, existential experience of the divine name, the sustainer, the provider, the nourisher. So that kind of hunger and thirst, just, on a physical, level, makes us experience God as the provider and nourisher in a more intense way. Similarly, when we, when we committed, when people did some mistakes, when we've done wrong, God is also the forgiver. So that kind of darkness and vulnerability, when we experience our own shortcomings, when our flaws, connects us to the one who is powerful, who is forgiving, who is the concealer of faults, as was stressed in the video. So the darkness is not to be perceived as negative, but it's actually something that brings us closer to God. If you're near to God, you actually cultivate more nearness to God. If you feel distant to God, you cultivate nearness to God. So in any case, these two modes invite the human being to always come into, to seek always closer connection with God. And I want to just stress that, I mean, in the beginning, I had said that also, Christian believers in Arab-speaking countries also refer to God as Allah, right? The divine name. And in the piece that I shared with you, that first word with Nursi, he focuses very much on, the formula of consecration, right? So the first word actually trying to express why is it so important to begin everything in the name of God, Bi-Ism Allah. Every Muslim starts every mundane daily act with that formula of consecration in the name of God. But the question is, which name is it that the human being wants to connect? So let's say you want to open a book and read, right? You say Bismillah, right? In the name of God. In that sacred name Allah, are all the divine names actually included. So let's say I want to seek knowledge. I know that God is the one who provides knowledge, is the one who opens the door to knowledge. That's a moment for me when I say Bi-Ism Allah, in the name of God. I connect to God's name, the all-wise, the one who opens the door to knowledge, and also the one who provides useful, beneficial knowledge, because there's also knowledge that is not very beneficial. So this formula of consecration is actually throughout the day when people go about their acts, to really live then in that sacred divine presence and make that connection and intimate, seek that intimate relationship with God. Now, in that piece, in the first word, it says, well, you are needy, you are weak. So, and as you look into the creation, everything else is equally weak, right, and limited in their capacity. But human nature longs for somebody who is always present, always, all powerful. So that existential need then calls us to connect with, the divine name, somebody who is omnipotent, omniscient, right? And so it's this existential reading of human nature that then draws us closer to the divine names. And actually, when we introduce each other, when we introduce ourselves to each other, we always do so by our names. When we hear a name, we actually associate the name, the person, with certain characteristics. So in the case of Allah, when we say God, all these characteristics pop in, right? So God is not just an abstract being, but he has certain attributes that he assigns to himself. And as we say Allah, we seek that connection, as was stated in the verse, with certain particular aspects of God. The compassionate one, the forgiving one, the knowledgeable one, the wise one, the concealer, and so forth. So I'm going to share with you, in my slides that we'll send out in the follow-up email, resources, a list with the divine names, which is not, fully listed here that I showed you. But then you get an understanding of these two modes of God. So now it's time to go into the small groups. And again, introduce yourself by your name and your faith background. And the question is very simple. Who is God for you? How do you relate to God? What is your conception of God? And so just like the personal sharing is important. Before we go any, not questions related to the divine names. If you have questions, you can throw them into the chat. Otherwise, Hadra, did you raise your hand?
Yes, I did. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon all of you. And maybe we can go into this in small groups, but I know you were talking about how God in the Islamic belief is gender transcending. So one of our readings was from the chapter of Al-Hashr. And I'm a little bit of a linguistics nerd, so bear with me here. In the verse number 22, it says, "Hu Allahu alladhi la ilaha illa hu," and who is the Arabic and Hebrew word for he. So all across the Holy Qur'an, he calls himself a who, but he's not a particular gender. So how do we reconcile that with the Quranic Arabic?
Yeah, in Arabic grammar, who is always gender neutral. Even like, I'm a German native speaker, the table is der Tisch, which has a male gender, but is the table a male gender? No, it's a grammatical gender that we assign to the table, but it doesn't say itself, anything about its, nature. So in the Arabic language, yes, the hua, which really, refers to that divine breath, has always been interpreted as gender neutral. So in that regard, I think that's how, Muslims reconcile that. And because of that theological, the theological explanations of the divine names, and really trying to emphasize to stay away from anthropomorphism, because there was, there is a danger where people think, oh, God is present in the things or object. No, so it's really important to understand that every being is a unique combination and configuration of the divine names, but God is not present within that person. So I think Islamic theology always tried to check balance, and especially, when you think of certain thinkers in the Islamic history, they always were very careful because they wanted to stay away from pantheism and the idea that God is fully present in a being. That's something that Islamic theology does not embrace, or the Quran does not embrace, because of these very interesting combination of the verses. Welcome back, friends. I've been going around the rooms and I really enjoyed the conversations. I couldn't, go into all rooms, but I
from what I'm seeing, rich conversations. And we could talk about God forever, of course. Yeah, can't fit into 30 minutes. It's been such a rich conversation. And there were some interesting questions coming up in one of the rooms that I was. Obviously there's evil and suffering around the world. How do we wrestle with that? How do we reconcile that with God being the most compassionate, the most loving? From an Islamic perspective, the one response is, one reflection is that God has shared his qualities, all of them, with humanity, with every human being. So there is the potential to use them in constructive ways and also in destructive ways. That's the power of human choice and human free will, that God allows the human being, to use the divine attributes in a way that are life-giving and, again, constructive, and help humanity thrive and flourish and grow and progress. But there's also the aspect that we have the power to use the divine attributes in a destructive way in order to create chaos and anarchy and suffering. And from a theological perspective, the world is a place of intellectual, moral, and spiritual growth. And so these qualities of God have opened up possibilities for humanity to either progress or regress, to decline or move forward. So that's actually one of the reflections when it comes to the divine qualities. And again, the divine qualities really in the absolute sense only belong to God. That's why human beings, especially, Muslims, always use the phrase, Alhamdulillah, all praise is due to God. So whenever someone praises me or someone praises a human being, Muslim response would be, Alhamdulillah, praise be to God that I was able to do that God enabled me to accomplish that task, because he has endowed me with the skills, he has given me the faculties, he has bestowed me, blessed me with the gifts, the intellectual capacity, the potential. I cannot claim ownership of the divine attributes. I have been only given them as a trust from a Muslim perspective. And I will be held accountable ultimately, as Muslims believe, on Judgment Day, how I used or abused these divine names. So the issue of plagiarism or copyright is very much at stake here. We always use, we make sure when we quote an idea from a book that we really give credit where credit is due. From a Muslim perspective, if you claim ownership of the divine names, that's a sin. So that's why constantly, when somebody is able to be successful, to, get a good grade, the answer is always, praise be to God. I cannot claim that success entirely for me. I have to give credit where credit is due, and praises be to God, glory be to God, because I'm honored to, be able to display the divine qualities. And again, every human being, compared to other creatures in the universe, human beings have this endless capacity to reflect the divine names, but they can also disconnect themselves from the divine names. And again, that's the issue at hand, which then explains evil and suffering around the world, because human potential, human nature has the capacity to be destructive in that regard. From a Muslim standpoint, the Quran makes clear that these divine names, if they have been abused and in a way that has created crime towards others, then Judgment Day, a hereafter, will be created by God. So in order to fully display his divine names, the understanding in the Quran here that the world is only limited, we don't get to experience the divine names fully. So there needs to be a realm where the divine names have to be experienced in the fullest sense. There is a sense of compassion here, a sense of justice, but it's never absolute. There's always this longing for more, and that kind of, feeling or emotional desire from the Quranic perspective is an evidence for the existence of the hereafter. So I want to remind, everyone in the room that next week there is no class. We will not have an evening session, but somebody said ICJS is like a candy store. So there's always more on Wednesday. I think on Thursday we have, and our team will throw in the link into the chat box. We'll have a conversation with people from the sisterhood, Salam Shalom. So please tune in. Always wonderful to have many voices in the small group. So there will be a link sent out if you register to watch the documentary, and then, you know, engage in, you know, the question of Jewish-Muslim dialogue and engagement, if that's something that you're interested in. And then soon coming up, we're also starting a course with my wonderful colleague, Ben Sachs, the Jewish scholar here at ICJS. If you're hungry in learning more about Jesus, peace be upon him, from the Jewish and Muslim perspective, we always explore the Christian Muslim perspectives, but I'm sure Muslims in the room are also eager to learn more about the Jewish perspectives on Jesus. You know, you're welcome to join us for that, for the mini course. Again, in the link, make sure to register. And in the follow-up email, there will be resources. Next readings will be coming. I think that's it for tonight. Again, we will actually, in the next session, you'll see these themes will always come up again. So when we talked about the divine names, and again, it's just a very limited intro here. So I hope you take advantage of the resources that I'm sharing, and if you're interested, pursue that further. What I also found interesting in the conversations in the small group, people very much were inclined to cling to the names of compassion and mercy and kindness and love. And that's actually what the emphasis of the Quran is. Every chapter in the Quran starts with, in the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. So yes, there are the names of awe and majesty and power, but they're always operating in the framework of mercy and compassion, that whatever the conversation is, that we should never lose focus that it's God is always involved with his mercy and compassion, even if we not always see it at first sight. So I think I'm going to close the session. Thank you everyone for a wonderful, rich conversation. Looking forward to see you in 2 weeks.